Welcome to Living Legacy Leadership, where we explore, discover, and share insights, tools, and strategies for a life well lived into elderhood. I'm your host, Donna Kim Brand, author, speaker, legacy strategy coach, and creator of the concept Living Legacy, where you choose to live life on your own terms while contributing to people, places, and projects along your life journey. I believe that the life you live is the legacy you leave. Now, the guests I bring to you each week all address some unique aspect of learning, leadership, or legacy. This helps you raise your own game as a leader in business and life, and also showcases some extraordinary people who exemplify living legacy leadership. At least once a month, I also offer a training session to skill you in game changer thinking for your own application. So get your notebook ready or sharpen your memory by tuning in your attention, and we'll dive right in. Now, our guest today is someone who you will recognize if you're a regular listener of ours. That would be the very one Douglas Brand, hailing from England at the moment. Now, Douglas Brand OBE, which is Order of the British Empire, is a British criminologist and retired police officer who formerly ran the Public Order Training Centre in England as a metropolitan policeman. Was a traffic cop, handled IRA bombings in London and coal miner riots in the north of England. He was the UK rep to the European Union and led creation of the EU Police Conflict Management Handbook. He was tasked with assisting with the establishment of the newly formed Iraqi Police in the aftermath of the 2003 invasion of Iraq. For this, he received the OBE from Queen Elizabeth I at Buckingham Palace. He's since been involved in numerous countries, assisting with post-conflict stabilization and establishment of rule of law. Currently, he's undertaking a Doctorate of Philosophy at Oxford University, exploring police reform in Kenya. So we're so glad to have you here with us, Douglas Brand.
Well, it's good to be back, and I just need to correct you on one minor thing. Queen Elizabeth I is several centuries old. Queen Elizabeth II was the one that actually gave me the medal.
Why, thank you. Thank you. Yes, I had my one digit missing there. Thank you. I should have known. So, we're starting on a light note here, but the reality is we're going to be discussing a very relevant current topic, and that is, what do we want from our police? We have the backdrop of recent death, or some would say the murder or killing of George Floyd in the U.S. He was a Black American by a Minneapolis policeman, and subsequent protest marches and riots. This has led to calls for defunding the police, who many say have become too strident, even militarized, using Pentagon's cast-off equipment and tactics. So you being now retired from active policing itself, you're a 35-year career police officer, still active in policing issues. So with that as a backdrop, what are your thoughts about what's going on, and how do we address the issue? What do we want from our police?
Well, as I know, because I know you discussed this before and more widely, it's very difficult to isolate issues to do with policing without looking at a broader spectrum of, what's going on in society. If we take the principle that was established by Robert Peel, one of the many principles when he introduced policing in the UK in 1829, was that the police should be representative of the society that they are part of. And that goes way back 2,000 years to Plato's concept of society needing guardians being trusted individuals to look after the interests of the rest, who are reasonably well remunerated, tested, and basically having sound wisdom and ability. And so the concept of this reflecting society, I think personally has sort of got lost along the way. And I think that there's been, certainly in recent years, but not exclusively, but in recent years, well, certainly since the mid-1990s, when in your country, the Pentagon started releasing surplus military equipment to police forces, rather than the situation that is often used to structure organizations, which is form following function. To a certain degree, we've had a reversed, where function, like what should we do with these armored vehicles that the Defense Department have given us, has led to a form, which effectively means, well, if we got to use them, we've got to train people to use them, and we've got to use the equipment, and suddenly we find ourselves in some areas with a police service or a police force or a sheriff's department which has little resemblance to what the original ideas of policing were about. So if we look at your history back into the 1800s, these frontier towns that were set up appointed sheriffs to, which was based on the British system of the shire reeve. Again, somebody trusted, appointed to look after the interests of the rest. But in most cases, the sheriff was guided by a town committee of eminent people. And I think that that also seems to have been lost along the way. So we've ended up with a situation where in some parts of the world, America particularly, but not exclusively, the police has become something of an authoritarian arm, which has in some ways sort of lost its focus as to what its purpose is.
Well, yeah, and in fact, I've often made the distinction in earlier conversations with you about, the British approach is keeping the peace, whereas U.S. police talk about law enforcement. And I know you've talked about the general notion, and you were commandant of the Public Order Training Center dealing with public safety. So, there are some, what shall I say, realizations or accusations, depending on which side you listen to, that in fact the police have become a dumping grounds. They've been tasked with too much, all the soft belly of society that end up out on the streets. Anything happens with any one of those elements, who do you call? Not the Ghostbusters, you call the police. And, a lot of these people have issues, mental health issues. We've picked up a gun culture. So when a policeman is called out to a situation, honestly, it can be life and death for them every time, in areas they're not even well trained in handling. Did you experience that yourself as a street cop back in the day, or as a senior officer?
Yeah, I mean, that's, if you like, one of the strands of the complexity. And if you look at the early research, for instance, in the US, the budget that was originally allocated for the development of community policing was in the mid to late 1990s, was quite significant. But over time, it's been eroded as other as important issues like homeland security has increased. And so investment in understanding those things that the police have become responsible for, like mental health and things of that nature, has been eroded as well. There was a piece of work done in the 1990s in the UK looking at 10 riots that had taken place in the United Kingdom in the space of 1 year. And the analysis concluded that one of the critical elements that led to these riots was the withdrawal of community policing, so that the police become effectively reactive. And so reactive policing, which is a very crude, it's an essential part of a policing strategy, but it's not the only thing. But the less that can be invested in the preventative side of policing, the more we have to rely on reaction. And reaction tends to be in circumstances which are highly charged, they're emotional, there may be crime, drugs, mental health involved, and the police officer or officers find themselves having to make very quick decisions in a very short space of time that have huge consequences. But I think that's just one element. there's another element, and this has been creeping in for a while, this so-called militarization of policing, which is not just down to the dispersal of surplus military equipment, but rather, who are we recruiting in the police to do what?
That's
and
right.
I'm concerned in many countries that the motives for people being recruited into the police, both from the joiner's perspective, but also from those who are recruiting, hasn't kept up with society's change. Some recent research that was done indicated that the police officers who had done a 4-year degree course had more flexibility and understanding of the challenges they were facing than those who just had a high school or other form of education. And that's not to criticize high school, but what it's pointing out is that policing is becoming so complex that you can't just rely on old, simple, standard procedures to manage all of the situations. I mean, when I went through recruit training more years ago than I care to remember, one of the pearls of wisdom from one of my instructors was, you are joining the police to deal with the grey areas of society. That is, things that people can't work out legitimately and lawfully for themselves. So don't start looking for black and white answers. And that's still the same today. We have procedures, we have training, we have the situation where police officers involved in shooting say, I was following my training. And nobody's asking the question, is that training still relevant? Or has the development of society moved on such that we actually have to think more carefully about how we train our officers? And then the most critical part, if I'll just finish on this point, the most critical part, which is when the police officers go from the theoretical training in the academy out to their police stations, they are put in the charge of a field training officer who, in one of my colleagues who I work with on research in Oxford, has recently done quite a significant amount of research in America, and finds that the field training officers are highly regarded by police chiefs, who state quite openly that they rely on them to steer the direction, maintain policies, follow the general direction that they want to go. But the field training officers themselves feel undervalued, used, and a dumping ground for all sorts of problems. So there's a real critical issue about both recruiting, the training in academy, and then how you transition to field training that needs to be addressed.
And I suppose one other layer here that I know you are concerned with in Kenya, but it's certainly playing out here in the States as well. And that's partly who's in control of the police, like who's running the show, and whether it's through politicization or legislative decree. And I understand this is part of the area that's along with budgeting under discussion now for reform. Are you up to what's going on with that?
Well, I mean, my research focuses on Kenya. That's my platform. But obviously, some of the things that I'd be looking at from a reform perspective is, what is it? What is this thing called reform? What is it that people want? What does society actually need? And what does it require? And when we do our analysis, we will find, I'm sure, that over many decades, there's been an erosion in social services, psychiatric services, medical services, educational, all of which have contributed to manifestations of misbehavior, and I'll use that word in its widest sense, misbehavior on the streets, to which the police are often called in circumstances of high volatility or high emotion. And it's even in my early days, it was seen that we would have to deal with people who had mental problems because funding had been withdrawn from the 24-hour social services, for instance, or